where it moves. So recognize that about K, that we can try to estimate it, but we can't be too committed to any one value for it. What scholars have done over hundreds of years is attempt to estimate how many people Earth can sustain. And Leeuwenhoek, one of the early microbiologists, and who built his own microscopes and saw many microscopic organisms for the first time, was one of the first to make predictions about how many people Earth could maintain. And all these points are different scholarly reports on how many people it's predicted that the Earth could maintain. The median of those values is about 11 billion across the way, with some very extreme exceptions. Some people here in the 50s thought that maybe the Earth could only hold, I don't know what, there's 10 billion, 100 million, less than a million people, ultimately. Those are anomalous reports. They could be right. These could be right. These could be right. They're just predictions. We're at 7 billion today. We know that more or less exactly. Scholars suggest 11 billion. But what does the carrying capacity depend on? What are some things that Leeuwenhoek might not have factored in to his thinking that we now know today that could influence K for humans? What's a contemporary factor that he might not have known about? Yeah. Birth control, yes. The way we use birth control is different than the way it was used back then. What else? Yes. Nitrogen fixation in agriculture. Yes, when I mentioned some of the agricultural developments that have spurred human population growth, nitrogen fixation was such a big one. And fertilizers, big part of the green revolution that helped to trigger. And those agricultural changes weren't factored in. The ability to produce more food resources per unit area, given fertilizers like that. Also not factored in, though, were the downstream results of such applications in terms of pollution and the harm that these waste products can cause. And fossil fuel use was not exactly at the same levels then as it is today. And the recognition that the fossil fuels we use are finite is a later recognition. They are finite. And it's not clear whether, how extraction is going to play out with demand. If the whole medical industry, the production of fertilizers is based in fossil fuels. You need fossil fuels to fix nitrogen and produce fertilizer. What if your fossil fuels start to become limiting, if they're not already? So factoring that in could have a big impact on how many people could be supported. Fossil fuels being finite, if they become severely limiting, you might lose the ability to run your hospitals, produce your medicines, and generate your fertilizers, et cetera. So there's many factors that are watched in the process of modeling these relationships. When you look around the world at how much people consume, it's not even, as I think you probably are aware. Humans are great consumers per individual. We demand a lot as individuals, energetically, both in terms of food and in terms of fossil fuels. We drive more, we eat more, and so forth, per capita. And there are a lot of people in the United States, so we tend to be high globally in terms of the consumption of the products of photosynthesis. Other areas where per capita consumption may not be as high as in the States or in Europe, there are just so many people, population numbers are so high, that they're also great consumers of the products of photosynthesis. So this factors in both individual tendencies as well as total number of individuals in a society when you think about consumption patterns. And so ecologists use something called an ecological footprint to, it's kind of related to your carbon footprint, which is a buzzword these days. But your ecological footprint is the amount of productive land area that is required to sustain your lifestyle. And you can go to a website and calculate your ecological footprint if you want to. Country by country, you can see that some countries exist well in excess in terms of their consumption of the available ecological space in that country. So the U.S. falls way above the line in terms of the amount of ecological resource use required given how much area of ecological space exists, whereas some countries fall below the line. New Zealand, a great example of that. But this is people. I don't think they're counting sheep here. I'm not sure how that would work. Yeah, and so there's your line, which you can think about with the world hovering above that line on average. What that sort of suggests is that that's the sense in which the Earth is becoming smaller because there's less and less available ecological space as population continues to skyrocket. And the population does continue to skyrocket, even though fertility rates are declining. What is one major reason why population numbers go up so dramatically still, even when fertility rates are declining? And you know this from your exponential growth model, I hope. Yes? What's that? A sufficient amount of resources? Yes, the fertility rates may be even declining in an area, and a spectacular number of individuals are still added per interval. Yes? The human population is already so huge that even small increases, even small percentages of addition of numbers leads to these massive new numbers of individuals. Because n is starting so large, any percentage of growth is a large amount of growth. Yes, that's in the nature of this compounding of the growth. So ecologists have always looked at human population numbers in relation to many of the environmental problems we face, and these are just a few we can have fun with, that are all linked in some way back to humans in more or less clear ways. That's when we speak of anthropogenic environmental problems. Anthro-human genesis caused or started, begun. So, of course, some of these are controversial, others much less controversial. But a connection between most of these phenomena and humans and human population numbers is pretty easy to draw in the minds of scientists and ecologists. The debate happens outside of science. The debate happens in the political arena. And you go to different countries and this debate takes different character, different shape. I really don't have a good sense for your cohort and your understanding. Whenever I have asked in recent times about things like global climate change and the role of carbon dioxide, usually students can't explain the link in a clear way. How many of you think you understand global climate change, particularly in relation to the greenhouse effect and carbon dioxide? How many of you think you could explain it? Hands way up. Yeah, so that's about 10 of you, maybe 12, who are bold enough to, because you know I might have called on you or something, right? But seriously, that's incredible. And I mean, it's incredible if indeed it's an important phenomenon. How about the ozone hole? This was a prominent point of discussion a while ago, 10, 15 years ago, but people seem to have lost interest. You get bored of such environmental problems. So I'm going to introduce the ozone hole, and we're going to talk about global climate change. And these are definitely important for you to understand for the exam and just in general. But the ozone exists in the stratosphere, 3 oxygen, atoms in the ozone molecule existing in the stratosphere and shielding the Earth from ultraviolet radiation, UVB, right? Or is it UVA? Huh? It's blocking ultraviolet light, one or the other, successfully when it exists high in the stratosphere. When there are certain chemicals, particularly chlorofluorocarbons, that can lead to the breakdown of ozone in the upper stratosphere. And chlorofluorocarbon was that funny word that Al Gore could actually pronounce, and he got into so much trouble for looking like such a geek because he was talking about these things way before his time. You know, I was in college like 20 years ago, and I was introduced to these same data, these same facts. And at that time, they struck me in a certain way as pretty much logically obvious given what I knew about science. And Gore was active in those times too, and he was one of the only people to pick up on this stuff. Unfortunately, he came across as a complete geek and had too many gaffes and just got completely railroaded. Because this was a guy that was ready to actually, I don't mean to be politically stumping or anything like that, but this is one of the very rare people who actually understood these phenomena in a significant way. He may have blown them out of proportion, he may have gone Hollywood, but he actually understood the science in these early times, which is to say like 1990, which is when all this data were already available. Well, ozone in September 1979 was starting to show a thinning in the stratosphere as measured by Dobson units, with the blues representing thinner ozone. For the first time, you saw a thinning to the point of these, about 220 Dobson units. And then by 2006, you had what was called a hole. It's not actually a hole because there's still ozone there, but it's so thin that it's letting a bunch of ultraviolet radiation through, which is mutagenic, which when it hits biological cells can cause mutation. And it was distinctly related to particular industrial pollutants, and specifically chlorofluorocarbons were playing a major role in the breakdown of the ozone, with chlorofluorocarbons entering the upper atmosphere, where in the lower atmosphere they can survive for decades before they get into the upper atmosphere, and they can catalyze the breakdown of the ozone molecule into free oxygen and a chlorine monoxide like this. You don't need to know the details, but that's how it functions. That produces what you see over time in the thinning of the layer. And here's some more data just to show you from 1965 to 2005, percentage in the change of ozone in the atmosphere. And changes by latitude, because it's primarily affecting high latitudes. The South Pole is where it's most severe, and these have to do with climatic effects that are seasonal in that area that stimulates that. At the equator, you don't see nearly as much change. But at the North Pole, in the last few years, this is the only press the ozone problem has received because of the great thinning up in the Arctic, and it's starting to become a more significant issue in the Arctic. But there's changes in legislation that were enacted to help limit the use of chlorofluorocarbons as propellants in refrigerators. They were used in air conditioners and refrigerators and many cooling systems. The laws limiting their production had a great effect, have had a visible and demonstrable effect on ameliorating this problem. Now, ozone up in the stratosphere like this is good, smiley ozone with a halo, I guess, because it helps to block ultraviolet radiation. But ozone in the lower areas is a major source of smog. So if you're from Southern California, you may have heard more about ozone in the context of smog. It's a big irritant for asthma and a major pollutant at these levels, but a major source of protection for the organisms on Earth at these levels. I did this to you once before where I showed you this and promised we would talk about the greenhouse effect. And we will do that starting with the lecture tomorrow.